Welcome back to Reimagine 2021. I am Yonah Hochhauser, and today I'm glad to be joined by Sten Laureyssens, Strategic Advisor for the Waves Association. Sten, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Yonah. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, first we want to give our audience a little idea of kind of who you are and how you got into blockchain.
Sure. It's actually a funny story. I've been gaming as a kid since I was, well, as long as I can remember. And I've had this friend that I used to play Counter-Strike with during lunch break since, I don't know, since it was like 12 up until maybe 16, 17. So I would always go home, grab some food, and as quickly as I could run to my computer. And we've played for years. We met a few times in tournaments. And actually his father runs a hedge fund, like a classic, traditional high frequency trading. And he picked up on Bitcoin like a few years later. And he, like at some point, we bumped into each other in New York, like after not having seen each other for maybe 3 or 4 years. He's like, hey, how are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. What's going on? And he's like, listen, I got to run. I got to catch my flight. He ends up missing his flight, texting me and said like, hey, if you're still in New York, do you want to like have dinner? And I know that's the night that he told me all about Bitcoin. That was January 2011. Nice. And ever since he started like teaching me about it, and we still trade together regularly. We talk pretty often. But at that point, it was more like, oh, this is cool. This is like World of Warcraft gold, but then different. So we kind of got the idea of digital assets, and then Counter-Strike moved into having these like skins, and it was relatively similar. But it was just a fun gimmick at that point. I didn't fully grasp like the potential impact up until maybe probably after GOX, like 2015. I started really trading more. Like we started trading algorithmically, and I started understanding like, hey, this could be more than just some full game, because I think most people don't really get the full emphasis of what blockchain can do or what Bitcoin could become. But everything started speeding up for me after 15, when I started like getting in full time, and traveled, did a lot of conferences throughout like 16 and 17. And have mostly been focused on algorithmic trading, the in and outs of exchanges, a lot of, let's say, ICO investing, and but also understanding like how the flow of money goes from like people who want to invest into a project and why they do so, or why they wouldn't. And I've tried to like co-align that at the same time with marketing, and that's probably where I am now. Like I think over slightly under a year ago, I was talking with Max Piatovsky from Waves on like, how are you guys doing? We had our office right next to each other in Moscow, so we sort of started brainstorming and said like, hey, what's going on? What are some challenges that you're facing? And one conversation led to another, and I've, over the last summer, which was probably a pretty good time to start doing that, but I've essentially tried to help them on some of their technical challenges that they're facing in terms of like, how do we combine with the knowledge that they have on a technical layer, like because they have so many things that they want to build, what do we build first, and what is the market moving into first before other stuff, and then sort of assist them at the same time on like, how do we market this, what message do we send, how do we penetrate certain parts of the world in a better or in a different way, how do we get to the right people essentially, and when do we get to them, and that's been an interesting journey so far.
And for our audience who doesn't know, can you want to explain kind of what is Waves?
I think it depends on who you're asking. If you're asking the core, but if you would be asking the core like community, they would probably give you a very different view than some of the people that would be outside and have known Waves as like any of the top 100 or top 50 or top 150 projects. But if you'd ask me, I'd probably say, in a personal experience, Waves has been an interesting journey so far. It has definitely sort of tried my understanding of, let's say, the different layers that are needed for blockchain to sort of like grow. And that's kind of what Waves is. Like Waves has had this vision since the ICO of, we want to bring blockchain adoption to a larger audience, which is a pretty big, like, oh, it's like pretty vague, pretty like build the future type of idea. But I think Waves, where it differentiates itself from projects like Cosmos or Polkadot or Ethereum even, it's an ecosystem that's trying to achieve this, but it has this mixture between building out like base layer protocols, but rather than simply waiting for other people to dive in and then like develop on top of that protocol or very like base infrastructure, they usually do that themselves. So they have this very foundational approach of being like a proof of stake or least proof of stake protocol. And then at the same time, they're actively looking for people inside their own community, whether that's community members or ex-team members that sort of spin off and do something else. They build the practical appliances almost as an example of what's possible with their technology. So they have this like very abstract approach of least proof of stake blockchain. They have their own smart contract with a few purposes, and like interoperable protocol. And then at the same time, they do these very applied activities such as neutrino protocol, which is like a stablecoin protocol with like a very specific multinational currency, like decentralized foreign exchange, like a lot of, but very practical, like really tailored to like, okay, we want to give people the option of holding their own currency, if it would be Brazilian real or Russian ruble or any like, let's say like really applied local currency, but then holding it from their wallet and earning interest on that, which is like a very practical, it's nothing abstract, it's like very concrete. And that's probably what Waves is, and then anything in between. Like a very abstract approach, very like primordial foundational infrastructure with very practical, specific appliances, but all with the purpose of bringing it closer to a larger audience.
Right. I mean, and that kind of is, you know, the goal. It has been, you know, kind of when is this mass adoption? When are we, you know, when is this going to become bigger than just, hey, me and my, you know, my cyberpunk friends and, you know, my friends who play Counter-Strike, and you know, when is this going to actually reach, you know, the mainstream in the real world? And you know, so far it seems to be, or so far the biggest influx of new people and new users hasn't really followed the technology. It hasn't been when there's a new breakthrough in technology, a new layer 2, a new scalability. It's followed the price movement in terms of a mainstream adoption. Yeah, and that we're seeing now. There's this big bull run, so we're getting new users in right now. But like you said, it kind of depends who you ask. This kind of has been this two worlds: the insiders and the outsiders. And for a long time with the insiders, for those who even put price to the side, just in terms of technology, there's been this war, kind of, you know, ever since I think Ethereum came out. Because before Ethereum was essentially just Bitcoin. Once Ethereum came out, then it started to be this layer 1 race. You know, which is the best blockchain? Which blockchain, you know, is the fastest, the most scalable, has the most value? How you know, yeah, the most functional. But I think, you know, pretty recently we're starting to see more and more like the future is pointing towards them all being interoperable. You know, with that essentially it seems like everyone's kind of accepted side chains, layer 2s, rollups are kind of the way to go, because no layer 1 really can scale so far without some sort of sharding or layer 2 or connecting. So now that it seems to be pointing in that direction, one, do you agree with that assessment that the future of blockchain isn't really no longer a fight between the protocols, but rather protocols all working together? And two, seemingly, you know, it does seem like they're all playing nice with EVM, because right now DeFi has, for the most part, being built on Ethereum, even though they're all connecting, it's seemingly they all have to play nice with Ethereum. Do you think that is the direction that it will end up going?
Those are two very good questions. But as I said earlier, I was interrupting you, but it's like, does it matter really in terms of like how scalable it is or how fast it is? I personally don't think that it matters yet. I think right now, as you said, like we're seeing this growth in let's say like cumulative blockchain user base. This growth is not following when the coolest tech is being built. Like when all of the DeFi run started at the start of this year, I don't think we've seen a massive influx of new people. I also don't think that we're seeing a massive influx of new people right now because of DeFi. No, we're seeing that influx of people because Bitcoin just is going to the moon. I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, and it probably shows why speed isn't important. I think what's important is, and that's also why Ethereum is still, let's say, number one, or well, number two, depends on from what perspective you're looking at. But Ethereum just has the most applications, and because it has the most applications, it has the biggest user base. You can do things inside Ethereum that you just can't do elsewhere. Is that because those other chains are not better? No, but it means that I think the majority of the people in the space are either in it for the tech, but everyone's in it for the money, in a sense, because everyone's sort of like deploying their assets in different parts, and they're trying to maximize the opportunity. And the best place to do that right now, from a DeFi perspective, is inside Ethereum. It's not so much that maybe some of the applications on, I don't know, Cosmos or Polkadot or Waves or just you name it, aren't faster or better or cheaper. I mean, it's ridiculous. I had some friends that said like, Bitcoin's going up drastically right now, but it's too expensive for me to take my money out of that pool by the time that I have it. And like, in terms of what I'm just going to leave it there. Of course, there's better alternatives. I mean, I could probably name like 10 chains that would be faster and cheaper or like free almost with the same application. But it just, there's so many people inside the Ethereum like ecosystem that are making their money essentially inside there. And that's the key thing. I think one of the, it's maybe a different analogy, but when the whole exchange user acquisition boom was going on in like 17 and 18, I was trying to help a few friends that were running an exchange, and they essentially said like, how do we make sure that we grow our user base? And it's very easy. You can usually teach someone only one or two things, but if they can make a whole lot of money, you can teach them a lot of things. But people are following where they have the opportunity of making money, and that's just currently Ethereum right now. Of course, there's faster and cheaper stuff, but and that's essentially an answer to your question. I don't think that it's all about having the fastest chain or the cheapest solution or both. Of course, it will be like a question at some point in the future, but the point of it, it's not because you have the best tech that you will be the winner. It's because you have the largest user base and you're capable of like captivating that user base and keeping it there. And probably the barrier of interoperability is also what's maintaining Ethereum's success. Because if things would be more interoperable, then things would probably move outside of Ethereum much easier. But because it's actually relatively difficult and it's like a slow process of migrating either user base into something else or it's just staying inside Ethereum. And I don't think it's bad necessarily, because it's forcing people to really, or projects to really be creative with how they address that problem. And do you try to migrate the user base outside of Ethereum into your own project, or do you try to migrate your project's functionality inside Ethereum? And I think to that topic, that's probably also what Waves did with Neutrino. We'll probably like elaborate on it a bit later, but in short, they were facing the same topic. we know that we have a good project. How do we increase the user base? And they too said, okay, it's ridiculous to go and try and take like the user base of Ethereum and bring it onto the Waves like ecosystem, because that's just a very big barrier. People want to make money inside their usual habitat. So they did the opposite. They said, okay, let's just port the functionality into Ethereum and plug it into Ethereum's DeFi, and it just boomed. Why? Because it's easy. It's much easier to stay inside your own environment and get something with a high like yield rather than having to go somewhere else for that high yield, because you're not going to make that barrier. You're just saying, no, it's fine. I'm not going to explore something new. There's too much happening anyway. And then in terms of your second question, what's the right approach for interoperability? I mean, we're not really facing, we're facing some tribalism, I'd say, in our ecosystems. I'm a Link Marine, or I'm a big fan of Ethereum, or no Polkadot's the next Ethereum. I think we're missing the picture here. Not everyone, of course, but I think it's much more important of looking at this quest of how do we bring blockchain into the world, and how do we achieve that? What, in an ideal sense, is the best approach for growing that user base with as little friction as possible? Because it's not so much about do we win this fight of my chain versus your chain? It's more, do we solve this issue? I mean, it's maybe an idealistic, like, do we solve world hunger and world poverty? But I do think that there's a sense of bigger than ourselves type of problem, that if blockchain wins, probably everyone wins. It doesn't matter if it's your chain or my chain, we will all win. Every of those examples will evolve into, I mean, why do people use Facebook and not Twitter? And why do people use Twitter and not Facebook? It's because they're all, in a sense, similar, but slightly different purposes. And I think people need to realize that Polkadot will be slightly different than Cosmos or Waves or Ethereum or any of the other chains, because they're very similar, but they will fulfill a different purpose. And maybe those purposes are not known yet, because we will see how the killer app in either of those protocols will roll out. Who knows? But it's more of like, how do we together sort of create sufficient interoperability between all those chains that we don't have that barrier that I spoke earlier of, like everything stays inside Ethereum, and it's actually difficult to pull things out of Ethereum. It's maybe anecdotal, but in a sense, I think, again, Waves was faced with that question as well. And that's sort of how their solution to interoperability, called Gravity, was created. They were essentially saying, how do we bring a larger audience into the Waves ecosystem without like facing those issues of tribalism and like my chain versus your chain? And initially they had the idea of like maybe bringing that interoperable solution inside the Waves ecosystem, but then they said, no, let's not do that, because that's just gonna like make one more copy of like what we already have 5 great examples of. So they said, why don't we create interoperability without creating a new token? So they're actually doing the opposite of what everyone else is doing. Like Gravity is essentially, it's like a set of smart contracts that connects to multiple different target chains, connects to Ethereum, connects to like Polkadot, Cosmos, anything you name it, like Binance Smart Chain, Tron, could connect to yourchain.com, like anything essentially. But there's no internal Gravity token. So they use the tokens of the projects that they're connected to. So anyone inside Ethereum's ecosystem could say, hey, I need some data that's sitting on Polkadot, but I could theoretically pay for that data or that access just with Ethereum. Or I could choose to pay for it with Tron or with Waves. Like, as long as it's a form of payment inside that ecosystem, it works. So you're physically taking away a layer of complexity by not implementing a new token, but you're also taking away a layer of like monopoly or competition, because it's essentially it's different. It's a different story. If Waves says, "Oh, we have this interoperable solution," and like it's inside Waves, then it's just a new level of competition. But if it's a combination of saying like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. We just want interoperability to thrive," but we don't want to win from someone else by like you having to use Waves for that. So in a sense, I think my view on interoperability is very closely aligned with what Gravity has come up as a solution for interoperability, because it's like it's weird because people ask like, okay, but how do I invest? Well, you don't. Like you can't invest. So it's funny that like there's no token. So it's like reversing what made blockchain grow so much, because you align like speculation and innovation with financial gains. So you're not doing that here, which is probably, I think it's unique. I haven't seen any project like approach the problem in such a way, but it's interesting because there's no competition. In Polkadot's white paper, it says like at some point at the end, it says, we don't see Polkadot being a competition of Ethereum anywhere in the near like future. How long is that near future? I mean, at some point, Polkadot is gonna like be equally big, at least in market cap. Like there's gonna be some kind of an ETH flippening or whatever. I don't think it means that it'll be better or worse, but people like vote or underwrite the system, especially if it's proof of stake. They underwrite the system with their tokens, and at some point there's going to be some form of a competition, and they're going to vote not just with their hearts but also with their money, because that's literally what they're voting with. So I don't know, it's interesting to see where that interoperability like topic goes, because if you don't solve it properly, we're just going to end up in a vacuum. But solving it properly, I mean, no one really knows.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've highlighted, you hit the nail on the head when you said, they have this great solution, and people say, but how do I invest in it? And I do think that is the mainstream thought process so far. Is the only reason that anyone mainstream is even in blockchain, or at least gets in. Maybe once they get in, they learn more about it, but the only reason they get in is that speculative reason, is to get that return on investment. So while we've kind of figured out how to get people in to own a coin, to either own a Bitcoin or own Ethereum, or maybe even sell them on an altcoin, how do we get them to actually use the technology? We're building all this great DeFi, no matter which blockchain, whether it be Waves, whether it be Ethereum, whether it be Cosmos, we're building technology. How do we actually get people to actually, now in the mainstream, to actually start using the technology?
I mean, I guess I kind of like Waves' approach of saying, okay, we're building these really infrastructural solutions, but then at the same time, we're trying to experiment with what we can do today. Like not tomorrow, not like in 2 years from now, but what could we build today that could be useful for someone who's just entering like blockchain, or heard about it, or saw in the news that Bitcoin's going up drastically again, and sort of like gets impulsed to start looking at it. And I guess, I mean, it's probably also depends on who you're trying to approach. Are you trying to approach the, let's say, proper paterfamilias, like the father of the house, who's like doing some investing on the side alongside his day job, and putting some of the family money in some stocks, buying some Tesla, like the typical, let's say, mid-sized traditional investor. They don't need a, let's say, local currency wallet with like, I don't know, Turkish lira, for example, that's paying out like 12 or 13% on a yearly basis, because some people don't have access to that. No, that person has access to it. So he will probably enter that space for a different reason. I think those people would probably make that first conversion into our industry, because they're looking out for those gains. And then again, they're not really, I mean, they would be using like DeFi products, etc. Maybe like, let's say he puts some money into like USDC or Tether, and then deploy some cash into, I don't know, into Curve or any of those lending protocols. But that's not necessary. I mean, it's using it, but it's still from a speculative perspective. I think in order to really use it from not merely a speculation perspective, but also from like a practical, let's say someone who wants to have access to banking services, but it has no way. For example, we have it's a Waves example, but in Nigeria, for example, we have a pretty active community, and I mean, most parts of Africa, they don't have like proper access to bank accounts. They use their phone, like balance of their phone to pay for stuff. So they have money tied to their phone number, and then they pay with that money in a store to buy food or to pay for stuff, which is crazy because the telecoms, they take like 10, 20, 30% on those payments. Those people would really be in need of even just basic banking services, let alone the crazy like yields that DeFi can offer to them. So this is probably like what I would identify as really using. But how do you bring them across? I mean, you have to bridge this barrier of seamless integration, which is the hard part. Like it at some point, and that's like the final curve in an innovation cycle, but the final part is where your grandmother is using the technology without knowing that she's using it. Mm-hmm. Like it's a part of her life, and she's like, oh yeah, I click here and it does that. She doesn't know what's behind it, but she knows what it does. And that's kind of where we need to go to. But I think where we are with blockchain right now is we're in such a like early stage. We're essentially just reaching the part of like converting an IP address which leads to a server, where in reality you're just typing google.com, which is then leading you to that server. We're in that stage. We're not yet in the stage of like, I mean, maybe we're in the stage of like search engines, etc. But we haven't really reached the stage of like the MySpace and the Facebook and Twitter. Like we haven't reached that stage of applications yet. In a sense we are, but it's just so small scale that it's just very soon, if you were to compare it to the internet boom / cycle. So I think we're a few years of really penetrating, but then at the same time we're not, because we do see like Bitcoin already being used for remittances, and I think that's been going on for quite a while. That's nothing new necessarily. I don't know, do you see, like from your perspective, do you see a big sort of like spike around you from like friends and family like reaching out to you again, like, hey, how's this going? Is this the right time? I've seen some people, but not necessarily equal to like 2018, but it's more like speculative.
Yeah, I would say any of the interest is still speculative. As people are only reaching out to me saying, hey, should I buy this coin? Will it go up? No one is saying to me, hey, I'm not happy that my banking is a centralized experience. I would really like a decentralized banking experience. And I think that really hits the crux of the problem, is that people won't say that, because at the end of the day, people don't care if it's centralized or decentralized, the mainstream I'm talking about. For the most part, the everyday person cares if it's cheaper, faster, better. And so far, the DeFi space in terms of banking and stuff like that isn't really, sometimes it's cheaper, and most of the time it's cheaper, sometimes faster, depending on how congested the network is, and definitely not easier, definitely not more user-friendly. And so I do think that we do need to get those use cases to come in. And one area I do think that has the potential to be better than the traditional solution actually is in gaming. You mentioned you'd play Counter-Strike, you'd buy skins. If I buy a skin in Counter-Strike, and especially with the growth today of freemium games, Fortnite, Counter-Strike, anything that's free to play, but you're paying for accessories, for add-ons, essentially you pay for the add-on and it's stuck in that ecosystem. It's like blockchain before it was intercomposable.
Of Counter-Strike in Fortnite. Or I could have like some kind of an outfit, like an armor in World of Warcraft, but I could play with that outfit in Fortnite or PUBG, right, or Warzone. From the moment that this would happen, like this interoperable, I mean, it's essentially Ready Player One. It's like you have these items of all these different ecosystems, but they're all usable in that one game. That's sort of like, that would be super cool. I mean, I'd sign up for that like now.
Right.
That would be amazing.
And that the only way that could actually happen, unless all the companies get together and decide to agree on one standard and one protocol, the one way to kind of force them into it, or not need the permission, would be with blockchain. Would be essentially with this trustless protocol, and that's one area or one use case where I think it really could explode, because one, it hits at that core audience of, at the end of the day, who is more willing to utilize new technology? It's the youth, and the youth are usually more gamers. So you're getting the demographic, you're getting that awesome use case, and I think that it really has the potential to be one of those first use cases, besides speculation, because like we said, no one's calling me up asking for different baking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think but then probably the only way it will work is because none of these larger corporations want to see any of those assets go outside of their own ecosystem, because why would they want that? That's essentially against their. It's also one of the things that I appreciate the most about blockchain is that innovation is so well aligned with the interests of the foundation behind the protocol. It's like I wouldn't say it's the first, but it's maybe one of the first things to happen in like innovation since ever, is because what is benefiting the protocol is also what is benefiting the users, and is also what is benefiting the investors, which is not always the same group of people, but in a lot of cases it's the same, which is very different from, let's say, a centralized company, because a centralized company wants to, especially if it's free, let's take Facebook for an example, like everyone is using Facebook for free. So if something's for free, you're the product. And the incentives of Facebook is very differently aligned with the user base. And that's not the case in blockchain, but maybe it is a similar case for gaming. They don't want to see that potential future revenue step outside of its own ecosystem. So probably the only way that would work is if you would have a one-directional bridge where you could plug the information of, like, let's say Steam and all the items that you have inside your Steam wallet that would go into like a blockchain wallet type of database. And you could do that with multiple games. So you could essentially tie your account in Steam, on Battle.net, on Fortnite, like any of the games. You could plug that information into a blockchain, and then it becomes like, rather than your ID, it becomes a wallet of all the items that you own. And then you could have a first game on top of that uses that database, that you could show all the items that you have in the different games. Or maybe that could become, maybe I'm sprouting an idea here, but that really could become like a wallet essentially for any other game to like tap into and say, okay, our game, you could use the items of any of the other games that you've connected to. So rather than like trading, like with one trading bots trading on Binance and Huobi, etc., you could have like one wallet that will work in different games. That could work, because I don't see any existing game to like implement items from, because there's trademark issues and all that stuff. So you probably, like, no one, practically speaking, it would be hard to overcome, but it would be cool.
I mean, yeah, of course, no company wants to give up the revenue stream. No company wants you taking items off their thing. And that's why I think it would have to be, and what essentially blockchain and crypto is a community-driven approach outside the realms of what is traditionally existing. So one, practically, in order for an item to work in another game, they'd probably most likely, I could see modders be building this. It would have to be running the same game engine. There's a lot of logistical issues there, and a whole rabbit hole that I'm sure we could go jump down. But the fact that we're even able to discuss this, have this conversation, just really shows the potential and the excitement that blockchain does bring. Because otherwise, like before that, why this would never even be possible. It wouldn't even be a thing. And so that's what really I'm excited about is kind of the potential because so far what we've mostly seen, especially in DeFi, is kind of just mirroring what already exists in traditional finance, but decentralized. The DeFi version of lending, the DeFi version of borrowing. When do you think we're going to start seeing these things that are kind of outside the box, that are things that because of this technology weren't even capable in the traditional world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some things, I'm going to take an example here of waves because it's probably one of the most practical examples that I could make. But let's take waves as an example. So waves has a least proof of stake blockchain, which means that slightly similar to Bitcoin for people who like are getting only for the first time in contact with this, but you have like block rewards. So essentially every block you get a reward that's being paid out. For Bitcoin, it's because you've done some proof of work, which is like you don't manually do that, but it's a calculation that's being done in a Bitcoin miner. But for most proof of stake blockchains, that you don't have to do any calculations. It's more like ownership. So I own a stake of that ecosystem, and because of that, I get a proportional revenue share of the block reward that's being paid out for every block, which is like a controlled inflation model, I'd say. But what Waves has done is essentially they said, okay, we create a smart contract called Neutrino protocol, and that protocol essentially says, okay, if you send Waves into this address, the total dollar value of what you've sent in will be sent back to you in a stable coin. So let's say I don't know what Waves is at right now, but let's say it's like $6.50, and I send in 1,000 Waves. It's like $6,500. About a minute later, the contract will send me back 6,500 USDN, which is like neutrino dollar. So I get like a one-to-one, let's say, issuance back from the contract. It's like newly issued coin. It's like no one does that in the traditional world. But what's the interesting part is like the proof of stake block rewards are still being paid out to the original Waves that I sent in. I no longer own that Waves, but the contract owns that Waves. So the contract is staking all the Waves that is being sent in and generating essentially interest. It's like around 6% per year. But the contract is also automatically converting the Waves, because the interest is being paid out in Waves, is converting that Waves into USDN automatically. And then it's paying out let's say the now dollar-based interest is being paid out to people who stake their USDN, not to everyone. So people who are trading it or like moving it between wallets, they don't get that, only to USDN that is staked. So that creates this proportional payout, because roughly on average, like let's say around half of the total USDN supply is staked. So you get like double, like usually it's between 8 and 15%. But you create a totally new mechanism of interest yielding, because it's coming from a sustainable mechanism, which is block reward payouts. Like that's just something that you know that is verifiable and it's always happening. And you convert it to an interest that sort of like never stops and isn't necessarily fluctuating because of market-driven like opportunities, like lending and borrowing in Maker. Like the yield that's happening there is because someone is willing to borrow or lend this specific coin. If that stops, then the interest stops, and it's a different type of mechanism. But that's cool, because you can't do that in a traditional world. You can't say, oh, I don't have like imagine something similar would be like all the new every new dollar that would be printed would be paid out as a passive interest to everyone who has money in a bank account. Everyone who has cash doesn't get it, and everyone who has money in a bank account gets this passive interest. Like that doesn't work. Like things don't work that way. So there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, the whole concept of stuff like Curve and Maker, like you wouldn't be able to replicate that in a traditional world. It's just impossible, because there's so many verification levels that you have to go through, and that just make it like anti-money laundering, KYC. Things are just impossible that way. Like risk. I wouldn't, even if a few banks would want to do it, I don't think anyone could copy Maker. It's just impossible, let alone something like Curve.
I think even looking at just the fact that you could get higher than a 0% interest rate is even impossible right now in traditional finance. So even without diving into technology, just the fact that even able to get a real interest rate is a huge draw in the blockchain space, and it's something I think that a lot of the mainstream is missing out on. Yes, it's a higher return because there's higher risk, I do think that if the world really knew, the sort of solid returns you could get just on interest, just on staking, just on APYs, I think there'd be a lot more people in this space as possible. Because like we said, what drives them is money returns. And we could speak about this for hours, but unfortunately our time is up. Sten, we'll have to wait till next time when we speak to go further. But I really appreciate you taking the time, giving us, kind of your thoughts on the sphere and a little behind the scenes about what's going on at Wave. So I really appreciate you taking the time. And I know our viewers do as well. And for all of us here at Reimagine 2021, I'm Yonah Hochhauser. Thanks for watching.